Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Jack Weston MCAT podcast, and specifically to our Cars Reading Skills workshops. As usual, my name is Molly. I'm joined here by Jack of Jack Weston himself, and we're going to head into a Cars passage today. Super excited, Jack. How are you doing?
Doing great. I'm excited about this passage because I know this is the kind of passage that really bogs everyone down and gets people anxious. So excited to talk about it.
Yes, most definitely. In case you have never heard of our Cars Reading Skills workshops before, definitely go check them out. We've done a couple passages now. Basically, the goal is to go through one of our Jack Weston daily passages, which you can find online on our website at any point if you're curious, especially to try those questions. But we'll go through the passage step by step, sentence by sentence, with the goal of showing you how to break down complex Cars passages. So today's Cars passage, as you kind of alluded to, Jack, presents kind of a unique struggle in some ways. What should students expect to gain from listening to this episode?
That's a great question. So I believe that when you take the test, you're going to get a bunch of passages that are really, really hard to understand.
Hmm.
And our natural inclination is to panic, skip the passage, basically do anything and everything to avoid what we're supposed to be doing, which is reading it carefully. And
Hmm.
so today's passage will be a great exercise on how to stay calm and how to really focus on the things that really do matter and how to identify those things because this passage is really hard to read. And
Hmm.
like, you may not get one or any of these passages on your test, or you may get many of them. In actuality, I think these kinds of passages are wonderful because there's less information that you need to remember or understand, meaning that less is more, right? With whatever you do understand, they're going to test you on it more. So harder passages usually have easier questions. Easier reads have harder questions, and this is definitely on the harder side, right, of
Yeah.
reading. So if we can understand the key parts of the passage, we should be fine.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and see this in action. Let's start off with our first paragraph. And again, we're going sentence by sentence. So let's look at just paragraph one, sentence one. It says, slowly and piecemeal over the early 20th century, Europe has been struggling toward the erection of some sort of international financial system. So, first sentence, we always want to make sure that we understand because it's giving us a lot of good context. Um, from this, right, especially from that language at the beginning, slowly and piecemeal, we get that it's a struggle. We see that Europe is trying to create this financial system, but it's hard or it's taking a while. It's a struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not clear why they're talking about this, and it does definitely seem like it's out of our normal discussions of life. Like we don't really talk about Europe's economy on a normal basis, right?
Yeah.
And so this seems very unfamiliar, and that's okay. I mean, you're going to be getting a lot of topics that you don't understand, you may not be familiar with, like art or history or art history even archaeology. You could practice that. You can literally go to our free Q bank and filter and find specific topics that you struggle with and work on those, right? Like for instance, this one is more economics, right? And so you could look for more economy-based passages.
Hmm.
And I think you just have to embrace it, right? And just embrace what they're talking about. They're talking about Europe, they're talking about setting up some sort of financial system. And yeah, I think that's good. That's really all we know so far. It's been slowly building an international financial system.
Perfect. All right, let's take a look at our next sentence, see if we get anything extra. It says, in Britain, the beginnings came with our trade depression, taking shape chiefly in governmental aids and guarantees for our export trade with countries whose purchasing power was feeble and unreliable. So this sentence is a lot more complicated in many ways. I think harder to understand, especially that second portion, but it sounds like, especially talking about being feeble and unreliable, trade depression. It sounds like we're just talking about how this was a struggle. Um, One thing though that kind of stood out to me, I'm curious if you noticed this too, Jack, is the fact that suddenly the author's saying our. What does that mean? Why is the author saying our now? Are
It,
they, who is the author?
yeah, the author could just be a citizen of Britain, right? The author could be a trading expert, some sort of government official. It's not clear, right? It could just
Mhm.
refer to society as a whole. Um,
Mhm.
but at this point, it's too soon to figure out. But I think you make a really good point. We're always trying to look for the author's position, right? And when the author says, I believe, or if the author says something very directly as to not necessarily refer to anyone else but themselves, right? Maybe implicitly or explicitly, very, very, very obviously. That's when we really need to pay attention. I mean, we have to pay attention to the whole thing, but the author's position is the most important, right? And
Mhm.
this seems to be more of our society, our country sort of representation, but of course we need to continue reading to figure that out. The other thing I noticed that you were great at picking up is the fact that there's some sort of struggle, right?
Mhm.
Uh, feeble, unreliable. It's not clear what they're talking about. They're talking about Britain and how they're in a trade depression and how it all started, and probably going to talk about how they started forming this international financial system, right? And it started in a negative way. But it's not clear, and our natural impulse is to go back and reread it. And you have to
Mhm.
fight that urge as long as you have tried your best to pay attention, because I promise you, there are going to be many, many sentences in each paragraph you read that are really not obvious to anyone, including the people that make this test, right? It's not something that they're necessarily an expert domain at. So, the best strategy to take is continue reading, obviously pay attention, right? But if something doesn't click, wait for it to click, because I promise you, when they want you to know something, it is obvious. And that might not be for a while, that might not be for a couple of paragraphs. We don't know. But that does not mean that we're doing something wrong. Trust yourself, have confidence.
Yes, especially
Okay.
in a passage like this. Okay, let's wrap up our first paragraph. It says the Overseas Trade Acts of 1920 and 1921 empowered the Board of Trade to make advances to British firms exporting goods to certain war-stricken countries and to guarantee a large share of any loss incurred in such trade. Okay, so overseas trade acts. It sounds like this is an attempt at some sort of financial system. This sentence is maybe a little bit more clear than the one that came before. Sounds to me, with the very basic understanding I have of a sentence like this, that this is still kind of tying into we're trying to unify Europe in this financial system. Maybe it
Yeah,
could be some sort of example.
yeah, it sounds like an example, right? This Overseas Trade Act is sort of trying to establish some sort of international financial system through it. Again, not the clearest. And so far, as long as we know we're talking about setting up some sort of international financial system and it's not been easy, should suffice. That should be enough
Yeah.
to continue reading.
Okay. Well, let's work into our second paragraph. And this sentence is a doozy. This is a very long sentence. So let's make our way through together. It says comparatively little trade was done under the conditions of these acts. And in 1921, a further amendment of the policy was incorporated in the Trade Facilities Act, the chief feature of which was, quote, the granting of credits and the giving of guarantees in respect of export transactions other than the sale of munitions of war between the United Kingdom and any other country whatsoever, end quote, and extending the time limit for such credits to 1927. Okay, this was a very long sentence, and when we're reading it independently, we could probably break a sentence like this up a little bit, especially because I think the first piece of it was probably the easiest to understand. right? Comparatively little trade was done. We talked about in paragraph one how this was a struggle. Now we're saying, overseas trade acts, we gave it a try, but we're not getting much trade, right? Doesn't sound like these trade acts are really working. And maybe we could call this Trade Facilities Act some sort of example as well, because it sounds like it's kind of highlighting that really we're not getting that much trade.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, reading this, all of this is a blur other than the first clause, right? Little
Hmm.
things done. That's all I understood, right? The rest of it was very deep, convoluted, and it makes you question whether or not you're on the right track, right?
Hmm.
This is when you're being challenged, right? I think anyone who's read this on their own probably felt uneasy when they got to this sentence. It's
Yeah.
so long, it's so convoluted. Right. It makes you question whether or not you're ready, whether or not you're prepared. And I assure you, they have done that by design. This is an intimidation factor, right? If
Hmm.
you just knew that little trade was done under these acts, that there is still some sort of struggle, there's some sort of issue going on, you're fine. You're going to be able to get all the questions right, right? You
Hmm.
don't necessarily need to understand the specifics of this Trade Facilities Act. Now, of course, try your best to pay attention. But the MCAT is not a stickler when it comes to details about the specific examples. They're more concerned about you understanding why this example was brought up, right? The
Yeah.
reason why they brought up this example, this Trade Facilities Act, is to show you that little trade was done.
Hmm.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Yeah, let's take a look at the rest of the paragraph. It says the state was to guarantee 100% of the invoiced value of exported goods, where the period of credits did not exceed 12 months, the state's ultimate liability remaining fixed, as in the earlier acts at 42.5%. Okay, this sentence is just a ton of detail. And I love that you just brought up, Jack, that when we get examples, right, when the author's bringing in a specific act or a specific, you know, situation that helps them support their arguments, it's less about the numbers. It's not, what percent of the invoiced value of exported goods did not exceed 12 months? Like, what was the guarantee? 100%, 42 and a half. Like, they don't care about the numbers. They don't care about the minute details of the examples. It's more about how was this example used to support the author's argument? I think there's so much power in that because to me, I read this and say, this is way too complicated for me to understand, and it's so detailed that there's no way a question's going to ask me about this particular sentence.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they may ask about the Facilities Act, but the answer is
Yeah.
always going to be the idea behind the example, right? And in
Mm-hmm.
this case, the idea is that little trade was done, right? That
Mm-hmm.
the trade acts were not successful ultimately. That isn't to say you should shut your brain off and
Mm-hmm.
disregard what's being said, right? You should try your best to understand it, but mentally don't psych yourself out. Don't give up. Don't go to the next passage and give up on this one. Um, don't start reading the paragraph again or the whole passage over again. The key is be disciplined and focus on what you do understand. Right. Okay, great.
Love that. Okay, let's move into paragraph number three. It says a certain amount of trade has been done under these conditions, though Russia was formally excluded from the application of the act. Okay, so we just came from paragraph two. We said we had very little trade. Now we're saying basically some trade has happened, but we don't have Russia. So some trade, but no Russia is present in this situation.
Sounds good. Yeah. This is a more straightforward sentence, right? It's
Hmm.
not that difficult to understand. But it is still suggesting that little trade is done, right? But
Hmm.
Russia is excluded. That I don't know if that detail is important yet, but we can understand it. We know Russia is a country, right? This is an international financial system, but it seems like Russia's not in there. Okay.
Okay, so it says this is the first of many mistakes for the act, for Russian participation is necessary to any international European financial scheme. Okay, this sentence, now my ears are perked up, right? I'm paying close attention this is a mistake and Russia is necessary. Those are both very strong indications of passage arguments. And again, this sentence reads pretty clear, right? So this jumps out to me as a sentence that we may want to track as we notice the passage arguments continue to develop.
Absolutely. Relative to every other sentence we've read, this is the first one that is very bold, direct, relative
Hmm.
to everything else, right? I have to emphasize that word, relative, because if you're reading a passage that's pretty clear, the clearest sentence, the boldest sentence is usually the most important. And there's
Hmm.
no question if you've read many passages like this, you'll see this time in and time out. This will happen all the time. There's no question that this is the most important sentence we've read so far
Yeah.
because it is not telling us someone else's opinion. It's not bringing in society, right? It doesn't say my belief, but we can assume that this is the author's position because the person writing it has not attributed this sentence to anyone else, right?
Hmm.
And so this is definitely an author's opinion, which is very important, and we have to track those. And it's making a very clear point that there is a mistake, right? And that mistake is that Russia is not involved, and it is necessary, right? Very bold claim.
Yeah.
So that's really all we need to know at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. I love how clear it is. All right, let's keep looking in paragraph 3. It says further attempts at international financial organization did not remedy this primary flaw. This is another very easy to break down sentence. We're basically saying we didn't fix it. We didn't fix the issue. The primary flaw, as we've defined it in the sentence that came before, was that Russia's not involved. So presumably, fixing this, or I mean, continuing to try, we still didn't include Russia. We're still going to have the same problems. So we're making that second sentence even more important now. We still haven't finished it, and this is or fixed it, and this is a primary flaw that Russia's not involved.
Very, very bold claim, very direct, making
Yes.
very clear that this is a primary flaw, right? So, just a continuation of what we've been discussing, but with more information to give us better context. Okay.
Mhm. All right, the International Credits Organization, set up under the Ter-Mulin scheme with the approval of the League of Nations for financing trade with impoverished nations, has so far proved sterile, chiefly because it required from the governments of the borrowers guarantees which they could not give. Okay, so this sentence, we get that we're talking this international credits organization. It's sterile, right? They never said Russia in this sentence, but coming out of the couple that, right, started our third paragraph, the fact that this thing's not working, maybe it has something to do with that, right? All I'm getting from this sentence, though, officially is international credits organization isn't working. Seems like it could be an example of something that's, again, broken, a system that's not working properly, but I'm going to see how this connects to the rest of the paragraph, maybe in the next sentence.
Yeah, and we're going back into the abyss, right? Where it's really
Yeah.
hard to understand what's going on. And so that's okay, right? We found something really critical, really important, and we can stick to that for now.
Mhm.
Okay, keep going.
I love that. Back to the abyss. All right, let's wrap up our third paragraph. It says another scheme outlined by Sir Edward Mountain, in parentheses, chairman of a large insurance company, end parentheses, proposed a syndicate of banks and insurance companies for the finance of export trade with the government guarantee against half the losses. Okay. Again, I'm still clutching to my, strongly worded arguments from before. I'm reading this and I'm not exactly sure how this is contributing, apart from the fact that we have essentially another situation which maybe this isn't gonna work. It's not super direct and it's not as easy to understand as the other sentences, though. So I think I'd probably wait and see what happens with this Sir Edward Mountain situation.
Yeah, and so far we've read three paragraphs and we really just know three major things. One is Europe was trying to set up some sort of international financial system. The other one is that it wasn't successful. And the other one is that Russia wasn't involved. And for it to be successful, you need Russia involved. It's necessary. So
Hmm.
if we can understand those 3 points, we're golden. We're going to probably get all the questions right. Right? That's all we needed to know. No. Now, yes, they brought up a lot of examples, right, in each paragraph, and you can definitely try your best to keep track of those examples. It could be important because they may relate to the ideas that we discussed, but ultimately, out of, how many sentences we've read, one or two were really important, right? That's it. And okay, let's continue.
Yeah. All right, let's look at paragraph number 4. It says these small fumbling experiments have made it evident that a larger, bolder, and more international remedy is needed, that Russia must be brought within its scope as a chief subject of its operations, and that all the great powers must participate in a task which is not merely one of restoration, but of development. Yay, a breath of fresh air sentence, right? This one is easier to understand. Um, and it ties back to Russia again, right? Our last couple sentences in paragraph 3 kind of felt like we were adrift in the abyss, but we're back on it. Russia must be brought within this international financial system as a chief subject, right? Russia is important. Russia is necessary. Any financial body should include Russia, right? We're coming back to those clearer sentences from paragraph 3 with this first sentence of paragraph 4.
Yeah, and that's what the MCAT's all about. They start with a vague backdrop, background understanding, and then they become more and more specific. They become very clear, and then they just repeat themselves over and over again. This is a kind of the repeating, paragraph where they're bringing back Russia, right? And how important it is. So yeah, okay, let's continue.
Wonderful. One other sentence here in paragraph 4, it says there must be an international financial body that includes all of Europe, including Russia. Wonderful. So if you didn't get it in our most recent sentence, here it is again, right? You need a financial body that includes Russia. Russia is necessary. Russia is important to this. If you have an international financial system or body, make sure Russia is included. Um, I love that, we started this passage knowing that a lot of these sentences are going to be really, really confusing. But just like you mentioned earlier, sometimes these passages that have so much confusing content in it, or so much that feels like it's just beyond what we can comprehend in the moment, there are a couple sentences that are important. And really, this is the same idea that we've talked about before. We need Russia. So we're seeing these things kind of combine. And really, we only need a handful of sentences at this point to get what is kind of developing to maybe be a main idea for us.
Yeah, yeah, and like we discussed, when you read a passage like this, there is less that they can test you on because
Mhm.
there's less that is really understandable. And so in a way, the MCAT is giving you a gift. When I see a passage like this on my exam, right, I would smile. I'd be like, great. I know everyone's gonna panic because that's what this is designed to do, but I'm gonna stay cool and just focus on what I do understand. Right? That mentality will take you very far. You'll probably improve 2, 3 points if you just have that mentality as you read. Right?
Mhm.
And that last sentence was as smooth as butter. It was really clear,
Mhm.
really easy, and it's nothing new. It's the exact same thing we've been discussing. Great. Okay.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to paragraph 5. And this whole paragraph is one sentence. So let's take a look. It says, for though governments can hardly be expected to add to their existing financial embarrassments by any large financial undertakings involving current public expenditure, their early cooperation, and we get like an M dash, right? All the major powers and Russia as well, and M dash, right? Is urgently required in order to secure the stabilization of exchanges and of prices, essential to secure from bankers and investors the loans needed to set the nations on their economic feet. Okay, that is one big tongue twister in my eyes. But what I'm getting from this really handful of words, early cooperation, including major powers and Russia, is urgently required, and I can tune out. Right? This sounds to me a lot like what we just talked about in paragraphs 3 and 4. Right? A lot more words, but really not a lot of new ideas or things to track. Right?
Right.
We need Russia.
Right, that's it. And you know, it's interesting because if we get into our heads, we may miss this, right? If
Hmm.
we're worried about our score, worried about the timer, right? Worried about why this is so difficult. We may miss what is actually really simple to understand, and it's right in the middle. All major powers in Russia as well is urgently required in order to
Hmm.
secure. So again, this is a common theme, right? Russia, 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 right? And so we just need to remember that, and that's what's important for the author. And the reason why this is so difficult to read is not because of the simple fact that it was an economics passage, right? It's also
Hmm.
probably written a long time ago, and this is how they wrote things, right? And it's more complicated way of writing that isn't necessarily, this kind of academic writing isn't really relevant today. So
Hmm.
don't blame yourself, right? Because I promise you, no one really wakes up every morning reading articles from 100 years ago. Okay. Uh,
Yeah.
but you can practice and you can get better at reading articles that are older, articles that are vague and lack familiarity to things that you necessarily know and understand. Okay, great. Last paragraph.
Awesome. So, what is this? Paragraph 6 says, moreover, the notion that any such work can be left entirely to private enterprise is unthinkable. Okay, so when you see a word like moreover, it sounds like they're saying like and also this, right? They're giving you something that basically to me it's like, okay, well this leads me to my next point. And in this case, now we're talking private enterprise. It sounds like we're saying don't leave it to private enterprise. The author is actually being more extreme than even that statement because it's unthinkable, right? It can't be left entirely to private enterprise. Um, I'm not sure where we're going with this. This is the first time we're discussing private enterprise, but I'm kind of sensing we could be, if the author continues, kind of going off to an offshoot of this argument somehow.
It seems like private enterprise is an alternative to including Russia. We don't know. It's
Yeah.
not clear, right? But if something's unthinkable, it probably has something to do with the fact that it doesn't include Russia.
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking so far. But let's keep reading and let's see, because so far all we know is that the author it does not believe private enterprise can solve this problem.
Yes. I love that, right? Think about these sentences in context of the rest of the passage. Let's look at our next one. It says, though the active work of financing such operations can best be undertaken by banking and financial groups of the several nations in cooperation, that cooperation must quite evidently extend to their governments, whose several and concerted action will be needed at the outset to secure sufficient confidence in the individual traders who are required to deliver goods for payment in terms of some new sort of paper. Okay, this entire sentence, Jack, again, we are in the abyss. Whenever I'm reading a sentence like this, personally, I'm reading and I'm engaged with the whole thing, but I'm very intently looking for things that relate to other sentences I've read that were clearer, right? Like I'm just coming from the sentence that says we can't leave it to private enterprise. What can we leave it to? Or what's the problem, right? What jumped out to me is what we're saying is we need to extend this to the governments. The government is necessary. We can't leave it to private enterprise when it said cooperation must quite evidently extend to their governments. Again, okay, cool, I got what I needed. That now makes sense. Again, not that I'm not reading the rest of it, not that I'm not trying to understand, but with the sentence that is that long and kind of convoluted, I'm looking for something I can grab onto. I'm looking for something that is at least a little bit more understandable than the rest of it.
Yeah, I love that kind of strategy, right? You're looking for things, you're hunting for things. What is understandable? What can you grab? And so far, I mean, the only part of this I really understand is that cooperation must quite evidently extend to their governments. But again, it seems like private enterprise is the opposite of government, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's probably why the author doesn't like private enterprise as being the solution. But
Mm-hmm.
let's continue. Let's see what else, where this goes. Last sentence.
Yeah, very last sentence of our passage. So, last of paragraph 6 says, what is more, Russia as a communist state could not be included in any private enterprise arrangements. And we are back to Russia, right? We started the sentence or started the paragraph saying, you can't leave this just to private enterprise. And now we kind of get why we need government involvement. Russia couldn't be included in those private enterprises because it's a communist state. So it brings us back to our
There
main
you
topic
go.
here.
There you go. Yeah. So the author really doesn't like this because again, it doesn't include Russia, right? And it's an offshoot argument. We should definitely remember any discussions on private enterprise were in this paragraph. But
Yeah.
in reality, the author was trying to expand on the necessity of Russia by bringing on, alternative theories and basically just, disarming them and saying that this isn't a good idea, right? Like we can't do
Mm.
this because it doesn't include Russia, right? It's another way of saying we need Russia. And there's a strategy that one of my students